I had been invited to the White House shortly after Trump was put into office. And this is something that many people don't know.
Content warning. This episode is not for children. All right. On this episode of Quick Show, we have got Sharon Slater. She is the president and co-founder of Family Watch International. Sharon is going to go over some things that you may not be aware of, both in the U.S. and globally, in terms of how a sex agenda and a sex education agenda is proliferated globally and in the U.S. She has worked closely with the UN and has her ear to the ground on these types of things. I think you're going to find out some very interesting information that you probably have not heard before, and that really probably very few people are privy to at this point. So we're excited to have her on. Sharon, you've got a slideshow that you're going to run on this. So if the audience, if you happen to be watching this on YouTube or on video somewhere, you'll catch that slideshow as well. And we'll just ask questions as we go through this. Excited to get some information about this agenda. Sharon, I'm gonna kind of just hand it over to you here and have you run with this. And I'll just ask some questions here as we go along.
That sounds great. Thanks, Greg. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. It's really important that people understand some of these threats to our family coming at the global level and trickling down to the local level. So I'm going to talk about the global sexual rights movement that's working to sexualize children. And one of the reasons why we care so much about this is Family Watch works to protect the family as the fundamental unit of society. And we've learned that in order to protect the family, we have to focus on protecting children, because children are going to form the future families of the world. And there's an all-out assault on the health and innocence of children. And they know, those who are working to sexualize them, that once you have the children, you have the culture, you have the future leaders, you have the world. So it's like a war over the hearts and minds of children. And this attack on the family comes from multiple UN agencies. I have some logos up here. You've got UN Women, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, which is supposed to protect children, UNESCO, the education arm of the UN, UN Human Rights, UNAIDS, UNFPA. And I'm going to show you some various elements from all of these entities working to sexualize children. And I'll start with the World Health Organization, which has been a lot in the news lately. But one of the things that you don't hear people talking about is their agenda to sexualize children. And they have created the definition for sexuality, which drives the comprehensive sexuality education agenda, also known as the CSE agenda. We're going to talk a lot about that today. Their definition for sexuality encompasses such things as gender identities, pleasures, desires, fantasies, eroticism, sexual orientation. So if that's the controlling definition at the United Nations for what sexuality is, you can imagine what would be taught as a part of comprehensive sexuality education. And I'll start with one egregious example. This is a manual, and it has the World Health Organization's logo on it. It's the Sexuality Education Standards for European Children. And they start as young as 0 to 4 years old, starting with that, saying you need to give these young children or toddlers information about enjoyment and pleasure when touching their body or masturbation, give them a right to explore their gender identities, so bringing in the radical gender ideology. And at ages 9 years old, they say also to give this information about pleasure, masturbation, orgasm. But one of the things that worries us the most, even more than that, is that it sends 9-year-olds to International Planned Parenthood Federation to learn about their sexual rights. Now, many of you have heard of Planned Parenthood.
Sharon, what is the purpose of that? Why would you take a 9-year-old? I mean, obviously, I think what you're getting at is indoctrination on that. But what what is the how do they get approval for that kind of thing?
Well, the UN doesn't have to get approval, and it's kind of like whichever UN agency you look at, whichever government is giving them the most amount of money, that's what government is driving the agenda. So Planned Parenthood is a major partner of these governments and also of the UN agencies because they create the majority of the curriculum that's out there that will promote these things. And International Planned Parenthood, which is also known as IPPF, is kind of the mothership. They have 65,000 service points in 170 countries pushing these programs. And I have up on the screen the cover of one that's all throughout libraries and schools in the United States. It's called It's Perfectly Normal. And this is endorsed by their US affiliate, Planned Parenthood Federation for America. And they say this is appropriate for 10-year-olds, and it shows 10-year-olds in various sexual positions doing various sexual acts or pictures. You know, they're pretty graphic, they're cartoons, but they're basically telling children that all of these sexual acts are perfectly normal for them or for anybody for that matter. This screen that I have up, it's a little booklet called Healthy, Happy, and Hot. Now remember, if the World Health Organization is sending children to International Planned Parenthood Federation to learn about their sexual rights, this would be a booklet teaching children who are infected with HIV what their sexual rights are. And I picked this up at the United Nations at a meeting for children under age 18. And it says, young people living with HIV have a right to sexual pleasure. And then it teaches them different ways they can get sexual pleasure, saying sex can include all sorts of things: kissing, touching, licking, tickling, sucking, cuddling, just explore and have fun. And then what's unconscionable, the World Health Organization is supposed to protect, set the standards, the health standards for the world. They're sending these children to IPPF. IPPF is going to tell them in this booklet that the countries that have laws that say that those infected with the HIV virus must tell their sexual partners they're infected with HIV, that these laws actually violate their sexual rights. So what you see is the World Health Organization and various UN agencies in partnership with Planned Parenthood promoting sexual rights at the expense of sexual health.
Okay, so I've got just a couple questions on that. So first of all, what is the difference? Because I think there's one side of that which would be, okay, well, we want to tolerance, right? We're going to put tolerance out there for transgenderism and for homosexuality and make sure that that's included in the corpus of the work that we're doing here. Where on the spectrum is it that it's okay, we're going to include this information for those that have a different sexual orientation, to the level of, as you said, mainstreaming it?
Right. Well, International Planned Parenthood in one of their sexuality publications actually has the step stair ladder that says, we want to move people from hate, and nobody wants anybody hating anybody based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. And usually I like to give a disclaimer about my organization at this point, that we condemn harassment and violence against anybody based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. We support the rights, the basic rights of everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity. But this stair-step ladder says, first we want to start and get rid of hatred, which we agree with. But then we want to get acceptance. Well, yeah, we want them to be accepted as people and as, children of God on this earth. And then the next step is to start to embrace, though, not just them as people, but their lifestyles and their actions and their sexual acts. And that's where this education is at. It doesn't just get rid of hatred or, discrimination and so forth. It's working to get not only, it even goes one step further, one step higher. They want their lifestyles to be celebrated, embraced, and celebrated.
Okay. And then the second question I have is the IPPF, what type of affiliation is there with, say, Planned Parenthood here in the U.S.?
Well, Planned Parenthood is their largest affiliate here in the United States. In the United States, it's called Planned Parenthood Federation for America. and they promote the same agenda, even probably more so. It's much better funded than most of their other affiliates throughout the world. And so, and I'm going to show you what they're trying to push here in the US with some slides, but they are the largest provider of comprehensive sexuality education here in the US as well, not just across the world. So here's one of their core philosophies. Again, this is where the World Health Organization would be sending these 9-year-olds to this publication, which is Exclaim, Young People's Guide to Sexual Rights, an IPPF declaration. And in it, it says that sexuality and sexual pleasure are important parts of being human, no matter what age. And they mean that literally. Sexual pleasure should be had at all different ages. In fact, they say young people are entitled to sexual pleasure, and how to experience different forms of sexual pleasure is important for their health and well-being. So this is a whole radical worldview that children won't even be healthy unless they're having sexual experiences. So that brings us to this document. This is the document that came out in 2018 with multiple UN agencies' logos on it. It's called the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education. And I like to say this is when the UN came out of the closet with their radical agenda in 2018. Again, it has even UNICEF's logo, and they're supposed to protect the world's children. But this document shows how they're trying to redefine abstinence. Abstinence doesn't just mean choosing not to have sex. It also means, quote, deciding when to start having sex and with whom. It teaches children that each person's decision to be sexually active should be respected at all times. They need to learn to define gender and biological sex and describe how they're different. And here's where it gets really problematic with the family and the relationship with parents. It asks children to differentiate between the values that they hold and that their parents or guardians hold about sexuality. So separating the children from their parents' values. And you can imagine this has the firepower of all these UN agencies, and this is sent to all the departments of education across the world saying these are the standards that you need to follow and that children need to be taught. So you want me to keep continuing? I was going to then take you to UNFPA unless you have some questions.
Well, I have a question on that. So again, I mean, this is something that I think a lot of people would question, regardless of where you stand on a number of these things. Not you, but the audience would stand on any of these things. There's a pretty broad spectrum out there that listens to this. But this is the thing that's just two things. Number one, why do they care about the sexuality of little kids? That's one question. Why in the world are dollars spent on talking about the sexuality of little kids? Is there any idea on that other than saying, well, these people are just all evil and they want to change it? Why do they care? What's their reason?
They're not evil in their minds. In their minds, children need to be liberated from their parents and their religious values. It's their religious values and their parents that are causing them to feel guilty about eroticism and these things, and holding them back from fulfilling their ultimate sexual rights, which is a right to sexual pleasure. So that's one thing, is they literally believe this, that children will be healthier. But Planned Parenthood has a more sinister agenda. Once a child is sexualized, what are they going to need? They're going to need sexual counseling, condoms, contraceptives, abortions, testing and treatment for STI, for sexually transmitted infections. Planned Parenthood is also even now providing in some of their clinics transgender hormones, which, if you can get a child hooked on transgender hormones for life, there's a lot of money in that. So this is a business, and if you can think of comprehensive sexuality education as the marketing tool to get children into the business, many of the programs that we've analyzed actually send children to Planned Parenthood clinics. It's part of the curriculum.
Do you think the dollars are a bigger issue than the ideology?
I really think it's both, because you have a lot of people who have this kind of a lifestyle that's a very sexualized lifestyle, and they truly do believe that children need to be liberated and they need to have the same kind of lifestyle that they do. And you see these kind of people who represent their governments in UN negotiations that are pushing these agendas.
Okay, so So you talk about, I mean, this is another thing I think a lot of people think about, especially with UN or some type of a global uh, entity like this. The concern there is a couple things. Number one, it's how are they getting to the children then, right? In other words, if they're trying to separate the children's ideas and give them a different ideology than their parents would have, how are they doing that? And then number two, what is the effect of that globally? Because it seems to me, at least in the US, that we're not as affected by that, but maybe there's third world countries that might be more affected by that because of the dollars that they need or whatever it might be. But is there a difference between the West and the third world countries, or at least the US and many other countries, on how they're able to get to the children?
The answer is yes and no.
Okay.
There is and there isn't. Okay, and I'll tell you why. We work hand in hand with a lot of governments, especially of the developing countries, especially African governments, who are constantly fighting this. They're constantly being bullied and blackmailed, and we even have a whole documentary on this. You can go to familywatch.org and you click on the videos section. If you click on cultural imperialism, where we have these government people speaking out saying they're pushing this on us, they're bribing us, they're bullying us, they're blackmailing us, and it's really hard. But many of them will stand up to it, but then they sneak it in anyways. And I'm going to show you in just a minute with these next slides how they sneak it into the children, even when the governments don't want it. And then we'll get to some slides to answer your questions about in the US, because it is here. So this, for example, you'll notice on the logo, this is a teacher training manual for Eastern and Southern African teachers. And I put IPPF's logo on it with an arrow pointing down to a circle that says Advocates for Youth, because one of Planned Parenthood's tricks is I can't prove it to you, but this is what I believe. They spun off this youth arm called Advocates for Youth, which is stationed here in the United States. Advocates for Youth pushes all things Planned Parenthood, their whole philosophy, their programs, and they're active all across the US in various states. They'll come to school board meetings, they'll come to state legislatures, and they'll say, we represent youth, and this is what the youth want, and then they push their bad curriculum. And instead of having Planned Parenthood's logo on this, they had Advocates for Youth put their logo on this, because they win when they say, this is what the youth are demanding. This is not what adults want. This is what the youth are demanding. And yet, why is Advocates for Youth in the United States creating a sex education teacher training module for African teachers? What do they know about Africa, right? And here they're co-publishing this with UNESCO, the United Nations Education and Scientific and Cultural Organization, and UNFPA, the UN's Fund for Population Activity. And as I show you a little bit more about this, this is Advocates for Youth website. Our bodies, our lives, our movements, pushing youth rights and that youth should get what they want. But Africans reject the transgender agenda, they reject the homosexual agenda, the abortion agenda as a culture. But here in their manual, it says gender identity is knowing whether one is male, female, neither, or somewhere in between. We show this to Africans and they get really upset. This is an agenda that is so foreign for them, but this is the exact same wording of programs they're pushing in California right now. There's a program being pushed by Advocates for Youth that's getting into a lot of schools in other states as well, but mainly in California is their biggest push, called Rights, Respect, and Responsibility. And it teaches, again, that you could be something other than male or female. And you ask, how do they get this to children, especially if adults don't want it, or especially if children don't want it? Here's an example. This is a phone app that UNFPA has created called Tune Me. And you can click on all the different topics, but I'll just show you a few of the screens that a child could get. This one is on consent. Consent is a very popular concept being pushed right now in the US, across the world. They say if you teach children consent, they won't get raped, they won't get abused, they won't have date violence, it'll solve every problem. The problem is the way they teach it is they actually encourage children to consent to sex and how to seduce each other to get consent. So it has questions here. that they're supposed to ask their partner, like, do you like it when I do this? Is it okay if I take off your shirt, your top, your bra, your pants? And they have children practicing those kind of things. There are a lot of other really graphic things that I won't share with you from that app. And then just one last example. This is UNICEF. This is what they're pushing along those lines. They have this document called Legal Minimum Ages and the Realization of Adolescent Rights. And they say in this booklet, for adolescents, the possibility to have access to sexual and reproductive health services, now that's a code for CSE, for abortion, for contraceptive, or whatever Planned Parenthood clinics provide, even the transgender hormones, without parental consent is a critical dimension of access. So even UNICEF is pushing along with Planned Parenthood that the children, adolescents begin at age 10, according to the UN, do not need parental consent for these kind of services. And
Well, that's already the case in the U.S. too, in many places.
yeah, they're pushing that. Yeah, they're just importing that, or exporting it, you should say, to other countries as well. This booklet was one of the first CSE programs I ever found, and it was brought to me by a delegate who was representing the government of Mexico at the United Nations. And it's a workbook for pregnant adolescents, and I'm sorry to share this with you, but I mean, this just shows you how depraved their agenda is. It actually has it's in Spanish, but here's a translation. It says, situations in which sexual pleasure is obtained. Now, why they would provide these answers is a mystery. Sexual relations with the partner, whether heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. Well, back then, that was pretty radical. That's pretty normal now. But this number 3, a sexual response that is directed toward inanimate objects, animals, minors, or non-consenting persons. This just shows you
That's incredible.
Depravity. And this is co-sponsored by UNICEF and the Department of Families of Mexico. And this is all the way back in 1999. And this is not an anomaly. These kind of things are, constantly being published and being perpetuated across the world. So I have an action item that I'm hoping you would allow me to bring up, because
Sure.
all of this also infringes upon religious belief, parental rights, religious beliefs, when these things are being pushed on children without knowledge and consent, and against the religious values of a community. Well, right now there's a UN special rapporteur who is an expert on freedom of religion or belief that's assigned by the UN to try to advance freedom of religion and belief. His name is Ahmed Shahid, and he just released a report that's supposed to advance religious freedom, except under the banner of advancing religious freedom, he did quite the opposite. He said violations of sexual and reproductive rights include any laws that ban gender reassignment surgery, limits on sexuality education due to the encouragement of religious figures. And he has a whole lot more egregious things that he has in this. And at the end, I'd like to invite people to join in a campaign so that we can stop that report. They can go to protectreligiousfreedoms.org and sign a petition where we're calling on the different governments at the United Nations to reject this report. It has, it promotes abortion under the name of religious freedom and all sorts of harmful things that undermine the family and religious freedom. So that's an invitation that we have. People can sign the citizens petition. And we're also looking for religious leaders. We're having religious leaders sign this from a different sign-on letter to show that the religious leaders around the world are standing up against this agenda.
How many religious leaders know about this?
Very few, and that's part of the reason why we're doing this campaign, is we're starting to reach out to religious leaders all throughout Africa and different parts of the world, and using this as an awareness-raising tool to also show the corrupt nature of these kind of entities at the United Nations and how they're undermining religious freedom, the family, children, the protection of life, and so forth.
Sharon, how do you work with the UN? Just as I'm going through this, I mean, how does this typically work? I mean, I know you've been there, you've talked. Are you part of are you invited to speak? How do you influence the UN?
That's a very good question. We've been working there for 20 years. And we have something that's called consultative status at the United Nations, which means we have a right to come to the various meetings that are held there. We can bring us to some of them, we can bring up to 20 people, 20 experts, and we can go in and we can lobby and discuss and kind of uncover the deceptive wordings to the governments that we know are more like-minded. But probably the best way that we affect the UN policies, and we've had a huge impact, is we've held an annual forum for UN diplomats, where they come for 2 full days, and we go through this agenda. We show them what, for example, the UN rapporteur of, freedom of religious belief or different entities are. A lot of these policies are passed through deception, using deceptive terms, and we give them talking points and all sorts of tools that they can use during negotiations.
Okay. Do you feel that you've been successful over those 20 years?
Highly successful. We've, in many cases, created the debates that have happened at the United Nations, because for many years before we came on the scene, a lot of these policies were getting passed over and over and over again without the countries accepting them, knowing how they were going to be interpreted upon in implementation. And now that we've showed them how the UN interprets these and how they're pushing, like, the comprehensive sexuality education. For example, we've rallied the entire African voting bloc and the Islamic voting bloc that now has a strong stand against comprehensive sexuality education. And I should mention that the Trump administration, I had been invited to the White House shortly after Trump was put into office. And this is something that many people don't know that President Trump and his administration is doing. When President Trump got into office, being the president allows him to put a lot of people in very important high-level positions throughout the government, throughout all sorts of government agencies. And some of these agencies include USAID, which gives our foreign aid and controls, millions, if not billions of dollars of foreign aid. Some of them are up at Health and Human Services, which direct a lot of the UN policies internationally related to health and global policies. And these are really good people. And one thing about President Trump is that he's very pro-life. So in that White House meeting, one of my main goals was to show the Trump administration how comprehensive sexuality education, which the Trump administration and the Obama administration had been promoting internationally at the UN, is the #1 tool to advance abortion. And when I showed them in black and white proof that this is how it's being used, the US President Trump administration immediately started fighting against comprehensive sex ed. And they've stopped it in multiple documents. And we've had a lot of success that way as well.
So when you say they've stopped it, has that been policy change here in the US, or is that support, or what does that mean?
That's a really good question. And it's a kind of complicated answer. But at the United Nations, there's constant negotiations going on. Like right now, the UN Human Rights Council just opened up for session. They have multiple resolutions on multiple issues. And almost every one of those issues, social issues, the European countries will propose comprehensive sexuality education as the answer to teen pregnancy, to HIV, to domestic violence. I've even heard them say it'll help with climate change. It's their #1 goal is to get it into those documents. And unfortunately, the US pulled out of the Human Rights Council, so we work with other governments to fight it there. But also right now, the UN General Assembly has opened up in New York, and there's all sorts of resolutions, and the US government is very active there, and they will push back in all the resolutions that are being negotiated, because it's like a game to see how many times you can get your issue adopted in how many documents. And the more you get them adopted, the more you're getting closer to establishing something as what's called customary international law. So the more we have governments push back against a term in multiple negotiations, then the UN cannot claim that this has been accepted, this is UN consensus language. And when their agencies go and try to implement these programs on the ground, the governments can say, no, we didn't sign on to this, or we just rejected this in this resolution. So it's almost a day in, day out game and fight over these terms, the same terms over and over and over again.
So when you talk about, okay, they push back on a resolution, I'm just trying to think about the practicality of this and how this unfolds globally. if you have a resolution that you've pushed back on, and therefore, what did you call it? Customary international law?
Law, yes.
Okay. So if this becomes customary international law, then what does that mean as far as a precedent? Does that end up saying, okay, if you want help and support from the UN in this, let's say it's Ghana or somebody like that, if you want help and support in this, you have to comply with the customary international law that's been put in place at the UN. And if you do that, then therefore you get support and you get maybe money, or you get what? How does that unfold to actually to the boots on the ground and the practice of policy in, say, an African nation?
So they wouldn't say this is customary international law, because that's kind of a concept that's out there that academicians debate, and they try to say that these do obtain the status of customary international law. In the US, what happens at the United Nations doesn't directly affect us always, because we have to ratify, any treaty to make it become law. But we increasingly have our courts looking to these decisions or opinions or reports or resolutions or agreements at the United Nations and acting as if they represent something we have to adhere to. And that's happening more so in developing countries. You have activists that will work very hard at the international level, the UN, to get these concepts or these provisions in these documents, many times deceptively. Then they'll go down to the national or the local courts and say, our government signed on to this or agreed to this, so therefore we have to change our laws with regard to it, even though most of these resolutions are not binding in any way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Sure.
Okay. We got a little bit more technical.
Yeah, that's all right.
Than I expected.
That's all right.
But I do want to bring this down to the national level and the state level and what's happening with this comprehensive sexuality education here in the U.S. So, you probably heard California, they have been the most advanced with this radical sexuality education. And in California right now, if you live there, your children must receive indoctrination in sexual orientation and gender ideology. It's mandated by law. You cannot opt your child out. Interesting enough, you can opt your child.
Has that been challenged yet? I mean, if a parent kept their kid out that day or those days?
We have a number of people that we're working with on the ground, and we're hoping to get some case to go up to the Supreme Court, because this is fairly new. This has not been around that long.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is they allow you to opt your child out of sex education, but not this sexual orientation, gender ideology, which they don't consider sex education. So that's a big problem that parents need to be aware of, because this is happening in other states as well. You may have an opt-out or you may have a law that says you have to opt into sex education, but they may not consider this to be sex education. So you have to really watch what's happening. So California is kind of the model state with the problematic things. And this is why Congressman Doug LaMalfa, he introduced recently, I think it was like 4 weeks ago, 2 bills at the federal level trying to also protect children in California, because California is also passing laws to fund transgender surgeries on children and adults. So Congressman LaMalfa, he introduced the Protecting Children from Experimentation Act, which would forbid or prohibit these kind of genital mutilating surgeries that can make children infertile for life from being perpetrated on children, and to end taxpayer funding of these transgender surgeries. And so I kind of like to have an action item at each level. The action item that I suggested for the international level would be to go to that protectreligiousfreedoms.org and sign that petition. Well, to help support this Congressman LaMalfa, you can go to our page at transgenderissues.org, and there you'll see an action item to thank Congressman LaMalfa and the other co-sponsors for protecting children by putting forward these bills. You'll also see other educational videos that we're going to be launching on the transgender issues and other key resources on that. Here's kind of just a listing of the videos we're going to be coming out with every 2 weeks, because the transgender issue is probably one of the most insidious issues that we've ever seen, and it's ramping up in schools across the United States in a major way. Because if you think about it, if you can confuse children about their very maleness and their femaleness, you confuse them about marriage, you confuse them about God's plan for them and their future families, and it's really a dangerous.
Well, I think I just read a stat. I'm not sure about the time period, but I think it was in Sweden the last 10 years, the number of teenage girls identifying as male has increased by 18 times.
Yeah,
Uh,
astronomical. They have
it's phenomenal. I mean, it's not like a little bit of an adjustment. It's major change. For whatever reason, it seems to be the females more that are doing that. It just seems to me, Sharon, that there's going to be. I mean, it's obviously going to be too long because of the idea of going all the way to the point of hormone therapy and transition surgery for kids. Is it's just horrific. But I can't imagine that there's not going to be just a slew of lawsuits from these kids against their parents.
But we're already starting to see some, thank goodness. And parents are starting to speak up, because in the US, the first video that we're going to be releasing in about a week is called it's called Transgender Issues, the Assault on Parental Rights. And we have the stories of 4 different sets of parents, or some of them, in some cases, they're single parents, that are losing the rights over their children, and the courts are taking away their rights and mandating that their children get these surgeries that are irreversible, harm them for life, increase their suicide rates. We have all sorts of science and data of the harm that this can do, and this is an issue of our time. This is a parental rights issue. This is a religious freedom issue. This is a child protection issue that we're all going to have to stand up for very soon. But when you mentioned the high rates in Sweden, the UK's numbers have been astronomical, increasing, kids starting to identify as transgender, but also in Utah. I wish I could remember the figure, because it was just told me a couple days ago from our president of Family Watch in Utah, Marilee Boyack. I think this is probably going to be wrong, but maybe, we might have been seeing 50 and now we're seeing 650, something like that. I mean, just skyrocketing everywhere. But I want to talk about the funding stream that your tax dollars is going to under the Obama administration. It started then, where 101 million tax dollars were going to these radical comprehensive sexuality education programs to so-called prevent teen pregnancy. And this continues under the Trump administration. President Trump has tried, and the great people he's appointed, and they lost in lawsuits to Planned Parenthood to stop the funding to many of these programs. And I'll just give you an example of some of the programs that were eligible for this funding that are funded across the state. This is Draw the Line, Respect the Line. And it has such dangerous teachings as teaching kids, here's safe, sexual behavior that includes feel up over the clothes, feel up under the clothes. Just some risk is mouth to genitals. And then it has risky and so forth. This is for 8th graders. This program called Making a Difference is in my state. I think it's also in Utah. If you go, I'll show you a website in a minute where you can find out which programs have been federally funded in your own state. But this is called Making a Difference. And it has this workshop that says, how do people express their sexual feelings? What is abstinence? And then it says, here's suggested answers that the teachers could elicit. This is what is abstinence: oral sex, masturbation, grinding, anal sex, touching each other's genitals, saying I like you, holding hands, equating all these things as equal ways of expressing sexual feelings.
Control of language is always part of these things.
Exactly. Then the last program I'll show you is this is one of the popular ones funded in many states. It's called Making Proud Choices. And it has these condom lineup cards where it has the penis in various states of arousal, and they're supposed to line them up in the right order. The sexual arousal would come first, where you hug, cuddle, kiss, and massage, and erection, and so forth, and including orgasm, and what to do if the male loses his erection. Now, you may be thinking, well, maybe this is good, for an adult to know, or and maybe there would be a context for this, but we're talking 12-year-olds. This is for 12-year-old children who should not be having sex and who cannot, in any state across the United States, consent legally to sexual behavior like this. So we've identified 15 harmful elements that are commonly in these sexuality education programs pushed by Planned Parenthood and their allies. Here's just 4 of them. It sexualizes children, teaches them to consent to sex, it normalizes anal and oral sex, promotes homosexual and bisexual behavior. And we have an analysis tool where you can take a program and analyze it with the 15 harmful elements down the left side, and you just put quotes from the manual in the right side. And we have most of these programs that are federally funded already analyzed and filled out with these templates. So you can go and protect children by going to our USA map, where you can click on your state and see your state profile and see which programs have been funded in your state. If you go to protectchildhealth.org, we have a national coalition. You can also join this coalition and join with like-minded parents and teachers and even politicians that are working in your state to stop comprehensive sexuality education. You'll find that USA map. And we have a video, which is our #1 tool for educating people about everything I just taught you about, focusing on the sexuality education program. It's called The War on Children. And by popular demand, it's been translated or subtitled in 12 different languages. And you can find that and a lot more information at stopcse.org. That's STOP. CSE is for Comprehensive Sexuality Education. And also on that website, you will also find that USA map. And if you click on your state, or if you go to the CSE Exposed page, you'll see a list of all the different programs that we've analyzed. On the left-hand side, it's international curricula. On the right hand, it's US curricula. And you can find the programs that have been funded in your state. And then at the stopcsc.org website, we have a whole Defender's Toolkit with all sorts of resources you can use. And if we recommend that you click on the first one, which is a Stop CSE Action Plan, with steps that you can take in your state to protect children from comprehensive sexuality education. So that's the end of the slides that I have. We would just also invite you, if you want to be kept apprised of all of these developments and what's happening across the world, you can also subscribe for free at familywatch.org to our newsletter. So,
you know, I think it's so interesting to me always with these things, how there's a positive thing that I always talk about, the wool sweater, right? It's wolves in sheep's clothing. And it's not just the wool sweater that's being worn, it's who's wearing it. And I think that there are positives, right? I mean, we need to look at how to work with those that have same-sex attraction. We have to, reach out an olive branch to those that are experiencing transgender thoughts and feelings, and make sure everybody feels loved and that they're a child of God. And I think that a lot of times these agendas get pushed with compassion. It's concerning because, the idea of changing the terminology or the meaning of the certain words, and it's all the same thing. Put some compassion in here and mixing that in here, and then we can try and push this through. So I think that the things that I see that trigger me the most, so to speak, are the parental rights and going directly to trying to get directly to the children and separating them from the parents. And then the whole idea of this transgender therapy and hormonal therapy and surgery done to a child is just atrocious to me. I just don't see how people can be pushing that kind of thing. I just don't understand it.
I just want to add that the person who we hired, who's helping us with all of our transgender issues videos, she herself struggled with gender dysphoria. In fact, we're going to be releasing a video just of her story, but when she was 9 years old, her and her brother were at the park, and she was 7, her brother was 9, and 2 men took them into the bathroom, and they sexually abused her, and they didn't sexually abuse her brother. And unbeknownst to her in her childhood brain, she decided that it wasn't safe to be a girl, and that she was sexually abused because she was a girl her brother wasn't sexually abused, so therefore she was going to be a boy. And she's got notes from her teachers, like back in 6th grade, saying Aaron wants to be a boy, and she acted out. She did lesbianism. She did all sorts of things, acted out sexually. And it wasn't until through a series of things that happened, she met a man who worked with handicapped kids where she worked, and she actually fell in love with him and got married, but she still suffered from this gender dysphoria, was very confused, but she had a baby. And she talks about in her documentary when she held that baby in her arms, just the beauty that she felt that her body was able to do as a woman that she could have never done as a man, and the healing that brought as she nursed this baby. And then she started seeing, and in Utah, we met her because she testified in Utah against the therapy ban that was moving forward, where they were going to outlaw, which they eventually did, therapy to help people with unwanted same-sex attraction or gender confusion. And she spoke out so strongly. She said, if they would have offered her before that gender surgery or that, what they call it, affirmative, therapy, and send her down that road, she would have taken it in a minute. It just wasn't offered to her back then. And she is so grateful she didn't, and that she was able to get therapy to help realize where these feelings were coming from, work through her abuse. And so she's one of the most outspoken persons about, they're not even allowing children to resolve these issues when they've been sexually abused like she has been, and the laws are just changing, and we need to stand up against them when we need to protect children and allow them to get healing therapy and not allow them to be forced down this road of these radical gender surgeries and hormones that are experimental, that cause, we have all sorts of people we've interviewed that have regretted this, and they're trying to warn other people, other youth, other parents, other doctors to say, stop this madness.
Yeah. I will say that, I do know people that have gone through, a therapy where they're, say, homosexual, and, the counseling just didn't work, right? There's certainly some issues there, maybe, and I've talked to several gay men, at least, about this, where, they're going to feel that, some of it might be emotional, but some of it obviously is biological as well. And the thing that concerns me the most is the whole thing about going to the children, though, around the parents. Again, I think that's the hard thing to me, because I think that obviously the parents are going to have, more than anybody else, more likely the best interest for the child, that, and I think that we've just really got to protect that. Now, I did want to also talk about, you brought up a newer policy from the church. Is that the how, when, and why, talking to your children about sexuality? Is that what that is?
No, I should have prepared better and had the quote right with me, because I didn't know you were going to ask me about that. But in the church's new changes to their policies, they have a little statement in there that says that they would encourage parents to stand up and have an influence on the sex education that's coming to their children, so that it would align with their values. So the church is recognizing that this is a problematic area, and these things get to our children without us even knowing it. So I would advise the parents on this call to be very careful, to go to the schools. And we have a problem in that as we work with people in every different state in the Protect Child Health Coalition, which is the national coalition here, parents will go to the schools and say, okay, what is the program here? Federally, you have a right to see any curriculum that your child is being taught. And they're only being shown like nice sounding outlines, and they're not being given the whole curriculum. Parents need to demand to see the entire curriculum, and they should have a right to opt their children out of anything that doesn't align with their values.
Yeah. And again, talking about parents, it's just, what is the state in charge, or are you in charge? Where is that going to go? And the problem is that the further we see that the dissolution of the traditional family, of the nuclear family, there is obviously going to be more and more of a reliance on government to be able to educate. It's a cycle that is, difficult to get out of, as you very well know, and that needs to be fought again. So I also wanted to ask you on, you've given some ideas of what to do with your organization and how people can fight against this, and how people can get involved with their schools, et cetera. Is there a direct I'm thinking of phones, right? How often are these agendas able to go directly to children, where they have access to the children, to your children, to my children, our grandkids, on their phones?
Well, then you're going to get into kind of child predation that happens, just on sexual issues in general.
Hmm.
And I'm sure most parents are aware that any time your child is online, a lot of times I'll do a presentation, I'll hold up my phone and I'll say, "What is this?" And they'll say, "A cell phone." And I'll say, "No, what is this? We're going to learn a new name for this. This is a pornography delivery mechanism." It's also a CSE, comprehensive sexuality education delivery mechanism, because they're working 24/7 to get your kids to click on things and download apps that'll teach them all about these sexual things. And so if you're not monitoring what your child is looking at on their phones, on their tablets, on their computers, they're bound to get either sent to sexualized materials, pornography explicitly, or even these sex education phone apps that they're pushing, especially during COVID. So we follow the webinars of Advocates for Youth, and they're ramping this up and trying to get it to youth as fast as they can, telling youth to spread it to youth. So parents need to be having these conversations with their kids, be aware of what apps are on their phone, and just be very vigilant.
Okay, very good. Well, Sharon, I really appreciate your time and going through all of this. I've learned a ton. I'm sure the audience has learned a ton from this. And again, this stuff is not generally spoken of out there. It's just, people obviously want to be careful and put up a defense to these things, and people understand that. But I don't know that we understand just how aggressive this is. Thank you so much for the time and for what you're doing and for all the effort that you give on this. I know you're a very hard worker. I've known you for a while, and it sounds like you've been very effective in helping a lot of people and changing some policy worldwide. So really appreciate it.
Great team that makes me look good sometimes. So I'm just grateful to you. You helped us early on when we were first starting out. I remember that.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
You're very helpful to us, and we're very grateful that you gave us this opportunity today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, Sharon. Appreciate it.